On August 31st, the Chinese Coast Guard carried out law enforcement operations against the Philippine Coast Guard ship No. 9701 that was making trouble in Xianbin Reef. Due to various factors, we currently do not know the specific details of the operation. We only saw that the Philippine Coast Guard ship on the scene was like a monkey that had fallen into a trap, running around in all directions and making a sorry spectacle. Previously, on August 19th and August 26th, the supply operations launched by the Philippine Coast Guard for ship No. 9701 also ended in failure. Now, some time has passed, and the details of the operation have been disclosed by a Philippine journalist on the Philippine Media Inquirer. From this, we can see how fully prepared the Chinese Navy and Chinese Coast Guard are. According to the description of the Philippine journalist, they followed the supply ship of the Philippine Coast Guard and set off from Palawan Island on August 26 to supply the Philippine Coast Guard ship No. 9701 on Xianbin Reef. Palawan Island is a relatively large island in the south of the Philippines and is also the main island where Palawan province is located. To the north, it is separated from Mindoro Island by the Mindoro Strait, and to the south is the famous Balabac Strait. Starting from Palawan Island and heading to Xianbin Reef, the voyage is only about 100 nautical miles. It is the nearest supply route for Philippine Coast Guard ships with limited voyage and combat radius. Using Palawan Island as a supply base to supply the Philippine dilapidated ships on Xianbin Reef and Rina I Reef is a natural choice. Isn't this a coincidence? The Philippine Coast Guard thinks so. And so do the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard. According to what the Philippine journalist said in Inquirer, less than 30 nautical miles after their Coast Guard ship left Palawan Island, they encountered the Chinese Navy. And as soon as they did, they encountered the Chinese Navy's Type 055 large destroyer, hull number 105, Dalian ship. This is the famous scene from some time ago. The Dalian ship, like a mountain range, stands on the sea surface, and in front of it is the Philippine Coast Guard ship like a small sampan. Now it seems that China is directly conducting one-on-one surveillance of the Philippine Coast Guard dock. As soon as the Philippine Coast Guard ship sets off, it is discovered by the Chinese Navy. The early appearance of the Chinese Navy immediately deprived the Philippine Coast Guard ship's supply operation of its element of surprise. According to the reporter of Inquirer, within the next 2 hours, more and more Chinese Navy and Chinese Coast Guard ships appeared in sight. Obviously, the Philippine Coast Guard ship has been targeted. And at the same time, the Chinese Navy began to shout and stop. According to the Philippine journalist, the content of the Chinese shouting in English is, "This is China warship. We're taking measures to control the Philippine Coast Guard ship No. 9701 that is illegally stranded in Xianbin Reef. You are not allowed to enter Xianbin Reef to carry out any supply operations." It is not clear whether the Philippine journalist is exaggerating or deliberately causing trouble. After all, warship refers to the Navy and not the China Coast Guard ship. This means that the action of intercepting and blocking on the periphery of Xianbin Reef should be an operation led by the Chinese Navy. In the end, when the Philippine Coast Guard supply ship was still about 20 nautical miles away from Xianbin Reef, it was surrounded by Chinese Coast Guard and Navy ships. According to the Philippine journalist, there are as many as 6 Chinese Coast Guard ships and 3 Chinese Navy ships on the scene, facing the Chinese Coast Guard Navy with absolute superiority in strength. The Philippine Coast Guard supply ship cannot move an inch and is stuck in place for more than 5 hours. At the same time, Chinese Coast Guard ships are constantly taking the initiative to approach to ensure that Philippine ships have no chance to invade the South China Sea. During this period, it is said that a Philippine Coast Guard ship, BRP Cabra, released a drone to reconnoiter the deployment of Chinese Coast Guard ships and try to see if there is an opportunity to break through. But as soon as the drone took off, it lost control. The Philippine side suspects that it was shot down by the drone jamming gun of the Chinese Coast Guard, because some of them saw someone on the Chinese Coast Guard ship holding a drone jamming gun. However, this is not surprising. When you release a drone in front of a major drone country, what's the difference from showing off in front of an expert? After struggling in place until after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the crew of the Philippine Coast Guard ship told the Philippine journalist that because it is almost dark, and the Philippine Coast Guard ship cannot ensure safety on the rough sea surface, so the Philippine journalist took the Coast Guard ship and returned. After returning, the Philippine journalist made a series of comments, saying that there really needs to be a new gentleman's agreement between China and the Philippines. Otherwise, the Philippines cannot compare with China in overall strength. If they continue to resist like this, it is inevitable that the Philippines will be the one to suffer in the end. The long article by the Philippine journalist indeed contains a large amount of information. At the very least, it allows us to see the tactical arrangements of the Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese Navy in the direction of Xianbin Reef and Xianbin Reef. Da Yuan calls it the port surveillance mode after all. The number of Philippine Coast Guard docks is limited. China can place a warship near each dock to specifically conduct one-on-one surveillance of your dock. The warship on dock surveillance undertakes the task of serving as an early warning force for the troops in the direction of Xianbin Reef and Xianbin Reef, specifically to monitor whether there are any abnormal movements of the Philippine Coast Guard. Once a Philippine Coast Guard ship is detected to be on the move, it can at least gain several hours of preparation time for the rear. This is why every time the Philippine Coast Guard ship fails to achieve surprise in its operations, of course, the Chinese Navy has been keeping an eye on the Philippine Coast Guard docks on Palawan Island, which means that Chinese ships need to be deployed at sea for a long time, which is a relatively big test for the physical and psychological conditions of the ship's crew, according to the statements and photos taken by the Philippine journalist. China attaches great importance to this operation and has dispatched the Type 055 large destroyer Dalian ship to undertake this mission, but in fact, this kind of large main battleship is rarely used to perform tasks such as port blockade and patrol. It affects the combat readiness of the ship's crew and also the system status of the entire ship. Otherwise, it would be no different from the U.S. Navy's occasional freedom of navigation operations with berks, which greatly reduces the service life of the ship, affects the normal training of the main fleet, and also affects the combat readiness of the ship. Therefore, from a long-term perspective, it seems that China can use some secondary ships to perform this mission. For example, most typically, the Type 05 for a frigate can be used for surveillance, compared with the Type 055 and Type 05-D as main combat ships. The Type 05 for a frigate is just suitable for this kind of port blockade and patrol tasks. It is originally designed as an ocean-going service ship. Furthermore, China can use drones to monitor Philippine ports, compared with surface ships that need to be deployed at sea for a long time. Drones do not require long-term human intervention. In the case of long-endurance drones, basically one sortie a day can ensure long-term surveillance. Moreover, China can also use human intelligence to monitor the movements of Philippine Coast Guard docks. In this way, the combination of surface ships, aerial drones, and ground human intelligence can ensure that the movements of the Philippine Coast Guard forces are grasped as early as possible to the greatest extent, with several hours of warning time for the movements of the Philippine Coast Guard forces ensured. The subsequent actions of the Chinese Navy and Chinese Coast Guard in the direction of Xianbin Reef and Xianbin Reef will be more flexible. It is estimated that there is no need to adopt the rigid defense we speculated before. They can completely stand by flexibly at a position about 60 nautical miles away. After all, the Philippine Coast Guard ships are on the outside line, while China is on the inside line and has a certain advantage in mobility. After tracking the movements of Philippine Coast Guard ships, The positions of various Coast Guard ships can be adjusted. That's why the scene seen by the Philippine journalist occurred. The closer to Xianbin Reef, the more Chinese Coast Guard ships there are. Before reaching Xianbin Reef, they have already been surrounded by Chinese Coast Guard ships. Needless to say, if the Philippine Coast Guard dispatches ships to Xianbin Reef at this time, the outcome will likely be the same, because the distance between these two reefs is only more than 70 kilometers. Even if the Chinese Coast Guard forces travel at a transit speed, they can basically reach there in about 2 hours. In this way, China can use one team to take care of both reefs at the same time, saving troops. This seems to be a naval version of mobile defense tactics. Judging from the report of the Philippine journalist, we can see that the actions of the Chinese Coast Guard forces in the direction of Xianbin Reef and Xianbin Reef are extremely well organized. The reconnaissance unit moves forward and directly monitors the port of the Philippine Coast Guard forces to achieve early warning. The main force unit stands by near the two reefs and adjusts the action route and defense focus as appropriate to implement the mobile defense mode. This mode is relatively efficient when there are multiple targets and the Philippine Coast Guard is in a relatively tactically active position. It saves troops and also shows the strength of the Chinese Coast Guard Department strategically. After all, deploying the frontline reconnaissance and surveillance unit directly outside someone else's port is not something that an ordinary non-sea power country can do. In other words, in history, only the British Navy often did such things, placing the reconnaissance unit in front of someone else's port. Once the enemy fleet sets out, it will be discovered, and all its movements will be clearly understood. Messages are transmitted by the service fleet. Sea powers all play like this, and now China has learned this trick as well. Finally, it must be said that the Philippine journalist is not wrong about one thing. The current actions of the Philippines are undoubtedly suicidal. They always try to unilaterally change the status quo. But in fact, every attempt by the Philippines will be pushed back by China. And China does not just stay at the original point after pushing back. Instead, it takes advantage of the situation to move forward a bit further and implement strategic pursuit of victory. Take Huangyan Island before. The Philippines failed to gain actual control and was instead driven out by China. Subsequently, China took the opportunity to achieve actual law enforcement. Currently, the Philippines is acting recklessly in Xianbin Reef and Xianbin Reef. The result will inevitably be that China pursues victory again strategically and achieves more strategic goals. In the end, the Philippines will surely end up losing more than it gains.